Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to have a look at a regiment of the Imperial Guard, one of the more famous and prolific regiments, the Tallarn Desert Raiders. These Lawrence of Arabia-inspired fighters hail, predictably enough, from the desert world of Tallarn, a rather inhospitable and sandy spot nestled in the Segmentum Tempestus. But Talan was not always such a near uniquely shitty place to live. Once it was a verdant and fertile agri-world. And then the Iron Warriors arrived, and virus-bombed it from orbit. Which really does seem like a particularly cuntish thing to do, even by Iron Warriors standards. And I suspect the few survivors of Talan that managed to make it into the deep subterranean bunkers and relative safety would agree. But it wasn't out of pure spite. If that makes things any better. The Iron Warriors did arrive with a goal in mind, as buried deep underground was a chaos artifact of rare and tremendous potency, the Cursus of Alganar, a webway portal of sorts, but rather than leading into the webway, it was a stable connection to the warp. Now, how such a thing could even exist is a very good question, but apparently it did. And this would be a priceless treasure for any Chaos Force. A stable and permanent connection to the warp would give whomever was in control of it unfathomable power and influence amongst virtually every other Chaos Warband, not to mention the demons themselves, willing to pay nearly any cost and submit to any service for access to the material universe. Neither the Imperium or the Tallarns themselves had any idea of the existence of this artifact. All they saw was that the forces of chaos had apparently deemed this planet important enough, for some reason, to conduct a massed ground invasion of it, even after virus bombing it. Highly unusual. Normally, when you virus bomb a planet, that's that, and the fleet moves on. Yet in this case, the Iron Warriors stayed, and waited for the virus to do its full job and peter out, devouring itself as it was designed to do, after covering the planet in the awful, liquefied, and putrescent remnants of its own life. And as this also happened during the Horus Heresy, where both sides were often quite confused as to why the other was doing what it did, this meant that the Imperium elected to send massed reinforcements to Talan without even really knowing how bad a situation they would be facing. The Talans themselves had survived in massed underground shelters, from which they would now begin to sally forth, both to link up with the Imperial reinforcements and to strike out against the Iron Warriors, who were also landing en masse. Now, this was only made possible by the fact that the atmosphere still remained. The Imperials viewed this as some small, mysterious mercy, for normally, after virus bombing a planet, the besieging force will also ignite the atmosphere, as it would at this time be filled with the flammable gases of trillions of dead creatures and vegetation. Presumably, the Iron Warriors had elected to not do so out of fear that it might damage the artifact they had come to claim, or out of simple convenience that it would be a lot easier to invade a world that still had an atmosphere, and that managing the artifact once captured would also be far easier, as the Iron Warriors presumably intended to dig down on the planet and make it a fortress for their own wicked plans. The atmosphere was, however, still very hostile to human beings. The overwhelming majority of the Life-Eater virus had killed itself off, but trapped in pockets beneath the sludge would still be remnants of it. The sludge itself was not conducive to human existence, and the stench of trillions upon trillions of cubic meters of rotted vegetation and animal life was enough to kill. Thus, travel on the surface was virtually only possible in fully enclosed armored vehicles. Even the Iron Warriors needed to tread carefully. Protected as they were by power armor, they would of course be resistant to the stench and any normal bacteriological infestation, but kick up a pocket of dormant life-eaters with a careless step or with the churning tracks of a tank, and it would swiftly eat through the seals of their armor and devour the marines within as well. By necessity, then, warfare on Tallarn was near exclusively tank and mechanized warfare, with the single largest armored battle in the history of the Imperium taking place on its surface, with an estimated 10 million vehicles of various designs and tonnages involved, fighting across the liquid oceans of sludge that now covered the world. And such a titanic conflict was, of course, no single battle, but rather 1,000 engagements scattered across a continent-sized field of war. Thrust and counter-thrust, riposte and assault, the endless hammering, battering blow of machine-on-machine warfare. The inherent brutality of such combat in such an environment, where the smallest breach of a tank's protective shell could cause the crew a drawn-out toxic death, forced the Tallarns to learn many harsh lessons in caution, particularly against an opponent like the Iron Warriors, consummate siege masters, and the ultimate blunt object. The last thing the Tallarns wished to be, then, was a nail. Thus they developed tactics of avoidance, of ambush, of rapid strategic relocation, maneuvering and scouting, identifying the weakest point in the enemy's advance before striking at it with ferocity and withdrawing with speed, leaving behind the greatest possible number of burning enemy vehicles and the fewest possible number of Tallarn equivalents. It proved a most effective tactic, and along with other conspiring factors, like the seemingly endless flow of Imperial reinforcements, and the fact that the Iron Warriors themselves were on a deadline here. They were needed elsewhere, on missions of a more official nature, rather than their own side entanglements. With no clear resolution to the conflict in sight, the Iron Warriors were forced to blink first, and begin to disengage from Tallarn, giving the planet's populace an opportunity to finally look around and behold the prize they had won so dearly. The planet was all but dead, the remaining population huddled in enormous underground shelters. Food was a pressing concern, as whilst the shelters had been designed for extended living with hydroponic farms, there was only so much that could be done, and Tallarn was near entirely reliant on massive amounts of foodstuff aid from the rest of the Imperium. Worse still was the fact that virtually all viable water supplies had been either outright destroyed or unrecoverably tainted during the deployment of the World-Eater virus. Only reservoirs found deep underground and a thin layer of moisture in the atmosphere remained. And as for the toxic slop that still covered the planet, it began to slowly but inevitably dry off, releasing yet further foul and toxic vapors into the atmosphere. resulting finally in the complete transformation of the once bountiful world of Tallarn into a planet-sized sulphuric desert. Most such planets would undoubtedly end up abandoned, if not by its people, then by the Imperium it now relied upon. But the former found something that the latter still wanted and needed from Tallarn: fighting men, trained in the arts of armored warfare and hit-and-run tactics against a superior foe. And with the Horus Heresy still raging, this proved to be an adequate trade for the Imperium's continued supply to the people of Tallarn. And they proved themselves to be capable soldiers, more than worthy of the support that the Imperium poured into their planet to make it, well, if not what it once was, at the very least, livable. But the trials of Tallarn were not yet over. About 1,000 years later, in the year 132nd millennium, the very reason why the Iron Warriors had so catastrophically transformed the planet in the first place was revealed once more, as the Tallarns happened to uncover the Cursus of Alganar, the demonic portal that Perturabo had sought on the world. By all indications, the Tallarn had uncovered the artifact purely by coincidence. It had, before the Iron Warriors' bombardment, been buried deep underground, ground that had now become sand dunes, shifting and moving, and in turn revealing their secrets. The Tallarn did not have long to ponder these secrets, however, as the Iron Warriors and fresh foes soon arrived. The first time around, the Iron Warriors had been pulled back by direct order of Horus Lupercal, and seeing as he was no longer in the picture, the Iron Warriors could potentially take their time besieging and destroying this world, were it not for the new enemies. The Eldar of the Biel Tan Craftworld. They too knew of the Chaos Artifact. They too knew of its power, and they feared that if the artifact was not destroyed, or at the very least kept from the hands of the Iron Warriors, that their very home, the Craftworld, would be the next to be crushed beneath fate's turning wheel. The much-abused sandy little planet was turned yet again into a battlefront. This time into a three-way push and pull between Eldar, Chaos Space Marines, and the now properly recognized Talan Desert Raiders. The conflict never quite reached the intensity of the one that preceded it, but nevertheless open war raged across the dunes for several months, until the Eldar elected to employ a rarely used strategy in their arsenal: speaking to people. Once they informed the populace of Talan that the artifact that they had uncovered was actually one of chaos, and one of tremendous destructive potential that the Iron Warriors would never stop seeking, the Eldar and the Talan agreed to work together to reject the advances of the Chaos Warriors and bury the artifact forever. If only the much-vaunted Eldar gift of foresight would also extend to the ability of opening their cock sleeves and passing wind over their vocal cords on occasion. It certainly would save a lot of lives, but then again, why break a few millennia's worth of proud Eldar diplomatic tradition over such petty concerns? And having survived their brief interactions with the Eldar at their least hostile, merely a planet-sized war, the Tallarns kept their promise and buried the artifact and deleted all records of its whereabouts. Now, you might think that destroying it would be wiser, but, if this thing truly is a stable route to the Immaterium, then blowing it up is probably not a good idea. And that is where we find Tallarn today. It is a desert world, famed primarily for its export of fighting men, as it has precious little else to offer the Imperium in return for continued support. Tallarn today is far more stable and self-sustained than it was back then, relying on several large domed cities, hydroponics facilities, and vast underground caverns serving as primary population centers, linked by yet further uncountable thousands of kilometers of underground highways and pedestrian paths, allowing the populace to travel from one settlement to the other without exposing themselves to the killing deserts above. But still, it is nowhere near enough. Tallarn is still dependent on imports of water, of foodstuff, of fuel, and on the countless other minute resources required by a civilized society. And a hefty import of armored fighting vehicles as well. The Tallarn customize these vehicles in their own special kind, and undoubtedly they will export expertise in modifications as well to Forge Worlds and other regiments expected to fight in conditions similar to those on Tallarn. But it is this that is the planet's primary strength. It has fielded hundreds of regiments into the Imperial Guard. Each one given, of course, as is the tradition, a customized numerical code, along with a battle banner. These numbers indicate in what order the regiments have been founded. So there is a first Tallarn regiment, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, and so on and so on. There are at least 440 Imperial Guard infantry regiments that have been raised and maintained from Tallarn. This comes in addition to at least 200 armored regiments and more than 24 heavy companies possessed of super heavy tanks. And then there is an unknown number of Rough Riders regiments, but as the Rough Riders is one of the premier regiments of the Tallarn Desert Raiders, their numbers would probably at least equal those of the infantry regiments, and probably supersede it. It's therefore quite likely that there is something along the lines of 1,000 currently active Imperial Guard regiments out in the galaxy right now that hail from the desert world of Tallarn. It is also important to point out that these regiments are maintained on a continuous basis. So should the third be destroyed, for example, its banners, if possible, will be returned to Tallarn and a new third regiment will be created. The existing regiments are also continuously furnished with replacement personnel, vehicles, and materiel from Tallarn as well, meaning that these 1,000 potential regiments have also been continuously maintained by the population of the world. A remarkable feat considering the minute percentage of the planet that is actually habitable. Now, it is also important to note that some of the regimental numbers may be misleading, and that there may even be even more regiments than we assume. On occasion, some regiments may be slapped into combined regiments or mixed regiments. For example, if 2 Tallarn regiments are so beat up that they cannot possibly continue as individual units, then the Munitorum may decide to simply take Regiment A and combine it with Regiment B to form a near or as near as possible full-strength formation. In these cases, the numbers of the regiments are often combined, either by taking the numbers and simply slapping them together, or by adding them together, or by some agreement between the regiments themselves. These mixed companies are rarely as valuable as the fully formed formations, and are on many cases dissolved after their tour of duty is complete, or the battlefront in which they are operating is being wrapped up. Thus, you might have a regiment returning its banners to Tallarn to form a new, fresh regiment, whilst the core of the old regiment is still out there fighting somewhere in the galaxy as an entirely new force. It is also relevant to mention here that these mixes, in the case of the Tallarn Desert Raiders, have a particularly high chance of failing. This is due to the fact that the society on Tallarn has evolved in a rather peculiar and tribalistic direction, probably as a result of the increasing separation between the various groupings, the tribes, the cities, and the villages on Tallarn, many of which have developed their own customs, their own identity, even their own version of the Imperial creed, in fact. Most Tallarn Desert Raiders worship the Emperor via a proxy known as the Oracle. This is the Pope, kind of the Emperor, his living incarnation on Tallarn. The Emperor himself also being given a new name, Abba Mushira. Meanwhile, other parts of Tallarn society reject the Oracle out of hand, stating that they need no intermediary to know how to worship the Emperor, and the two factions have often come to violent blows with one another. Obviously, trying to mix a pair of regiments with these differing beliefs are going to cause a tremendous degree of friction within the ranks. Additionally, Tallarn society is also divided into thousands of tribes. These tribes can be more concretely cemented into tribal alliances, with names such as the Hawadi or the Bana, which can contain within them hundreds upon hundreds of tribes. And to make things even more complicated, Tallarn also have their own language, Cants. There is a High Cant, which is the official language of Tallarn in matters of proper business and communication with the Imperium. There are then absolutely countless variants of Low Cant, tribal variants, alliance variants, battle cants, local variants, etc., 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 etc. Presumably, when regiments are raised, they are raised at the very least within the same tribal alliance, or at the very least within those with relevant and equal sympathies. But in the case of a mixed formation created by the Ministorum, well, it does not take such niceties into consideration, and so there's a good chance that the new mix doesn't even share a language, much less doctrine or tradition or even religion. Many of these peculiarities also make it difficult for the Tallarn to function alongside other Imperial Guard regiments, leading the Munitorum to try and deploy them together wherever possible. And considering their high degree of specialization, that makes sense anyways. And it's not just in the environmental conditions that the Tallarn are specialized. There are undoubtedly dozens upon dozens upon dozens of other inhabited desert worlds stretched throughout the Imperium, but very few produce fighters as fine as Tallarn, because their way of warfare is quite unusual within the Imperium, focusing on the exclusion of nearly all other factors on speed, on initiative, and the ability to strike effectively and move rapidly. Now, this may sound simple enough and obviously desirable, but it is not. For a regimental-sized formation to be able to get around the enemy, to find and then strike at their weak points, or even more complicated, to figure out the area in which they are operating, to prepare ambushes, or to outflank them all on a larger battlefront, requires a tremendous amount of decentralized control. In most Imperial Guard regiments, the formation is deployed as one large formation, where the commander makes most of the immediate strategic decisions, and then it is up to his sub-officers to actually carry them out. In the case of the Talan, it is often left up to the sergeants, the non-commissioned officers, or the Duf Adar, as they call themselves, as apparently they take offense at the word sergeant. This unusually flexible and fluid command structure is necessary because in a desert environment, the regiments are likely to need to cover huge areas of terrain, without any natural impediments like vast, dense forests or big mountains to stop an enemy's advance or funnel them in certain areas, or with the lack of infrastructure like major roads, etc., then finding your enemy becomes pretty goddamn difficult. You have no idea where they are. At best, you've got an idea of what their objectives might be, and you might have an idea of where they're coming from, which will narrow it down to, a few hundred kilometers of featureless, deadly terrain. Covering all of that effectively, and fighting effectively, with less than 10,000 men is gonna be a challenge. And even then, we're talking about a relatively small area. To put this into a bit of perspective here, the largest desert on Earth, the Sahara, covers an area of some 9 million square kilometers, or 3.5 million square miles. And that's only a relatively tiny spot on our big blue planet. Imagine a continent-sized desert. Hell, imagine a planet-sized desert. And then imagine trying to find anything in it. Forget the needle in the haystack. We're looking for a grain of sand in the Sahara. And with such unfathomable areas to cover, there are countless challenges for the Tallarn formations. One of the most obvious ones and most directly relevant to warfare is finding the enemy. The Tallarn use a wide variety of special equipment for this. They favor the long lass, for example. And officers and non-commissioned officers will no doubt be bringing along with them a whole heaping heck of a lot of different optics, and thermals, and goggles, and image magnifiers, and whatever else they can get their grubby little paws on. They'll also no doubt be using a hell of a lot of specialized Vox equipment as well, as even if a squad manages to find the enemy, if it's a proper column of troops moving through the desert, you're gonna need a hell of a lot more than 12 men to engage it with. Meaning that the squad needs to be able to effectively communicate with all of the other squads scattered across the hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers of desert, and then be able to move them effectively to intercept and destroy the enemy. Which brings up my favorite topic, of course, logistics. Oh, yes indeed. And bearing in mind the nature of the environment, a literal desert, logistic not only becomes more important than ever, but more difficult than ever as well. And the primary challenge, of course, is water. The average human should be taking on board about 4 liters of fluids every day. Now, of course, this is the recommended number, and you can survive on significantly less. And it isn't like you need to drink all of it in a day. A lot of it will come from your food as well. But in the desert, whilst moving, bearing full kit, and constantly struggling up and down sand dunes, etc., you're probably going to be wanting the full 4 liters, and probably more, to replace the fluid loss from perspiration and exertion. Now, I'm sure the Tallarns have learned these lessons many times over, and will be bringing equipment and gear specialized for dealing with this water loss, and also for carrying water relatively easily. But this still means that a single man is going to have to carry around 4 odd liters for every day he's out in the desert, or have some way to be resupplied with this amount on a daily basis. That's a lot of water. And the ability to supply it will determine how far afield the regiment can actually range. This obviously gives armoured regiments and rough rider regiments an enormous edge over their foot-slugging compatriots, as beasts of burdens and straight-up tanks and sentinels can carry a hell of a lot more supplies than an infantryman can. Indeed, the Desert Raiders have even adopted a big old desert-dwelling creature to do precisely this, the Mukaali. This creature is not indigenous to Tallarn, of course, due to, the whole virus bombing thing wiping out all life, but instead is an import from the planet Goru Prime. Another desert planet, but nowhere near as hostile as Tallarn, the people of Goru Prime have reached an agreement with the people of Tallarn, and every decade they ship them thousands upon thousands of these beasts to serve as mounts in the Rough Rider regiments. The Mukaali is not particularly fast, by the standards of Rough Rider regiment mounts, nor is it particularly tough compared to the mounts of the Death Corps of Krieg, for example. In fact, as far as combat mounts go, the Mukaali are vastly inferior to simple horses. But when it comes to surviving in the deep desert, the Mukaali is vastly superior to virtually any alternative. These big beasts with their soft and flattened feet can walk easily across even the deepest of sand dunes, as well as ascending and descending easily. They also can survive on next to no water for extended periods of times, and they're also big and beautiful chonky creatures, giving them a significant carry capacity. The perfect scouting mount, in other words, particularly in desert environments. Another favoured mount of a more mechanical persuasion is the Sentinel. The humble Sentinel. Often overlooked and ignored, it actually fulfills a wide variety of tasks within the Imperial Guard, and this flexibility makes it ideal for operations in the desert. Obviously, it has massive advantages as a scouting vehicle, as it is equipped, of course, with highly sophisticated gyro stabilizers, allowing it to move at significant speed across even the most difficult terrain. The Scout Sentinel is able to do much the same as what the Rough Riders are, but mechanized. It can move long distances at speed and carry significant supplies for its rider and itself. Now, I do imagine that the twin power plant is going to get a little bit hot, especially in, again, aforementioned environment, but I'm sure the Tallarn Desert Raiders have found some way around this, or some special modification that they can make to their Sentinels to make them a little bit less prone to overheating, as this is also one of the main problems with logistics in the desert. You see, it's relatively simple to transport large quantities of supplies to frontline formations. You just need to use a truck. But the problems, of course, are, well, one, getting there, as wheeled vehicles tend to have a bit of a problem with enormous deserts, but more pressingly is the fact that they use internal combustion engines, which tend to get rather hot, even in ideal conditions. And in the middle of a sweltering desert, well, let's just say that the truck is going to need to carry almost as much in the way of spare parts and coolant as it is supplies. And still, the attrition will no doubt be horrendous. And so for the Tallarn Desert Raiders, since their entire shtick is being able to operate deeper in the desert than anyone else, for longer than anyone else, and more effectively than anyone else, they're going to need to get a lot more innovative when it comes to gathering their supplies. Now, a lot of it will probably be delivered via Sentinels, or specially manufactured Scout Salamanders perhaps, or even maybe some form of unique truck design. The problem with that is that the Imperium is hardly the most, technologically advanced of factions, and savants, the likes of which capable of custom manufacturing a truck capable of operating in desert conditions, are few and far between indeed. Thus, whilst old school it may certainly be, the best bet may lie in good old-fashioned beasts of burden, like the Mukali, or whatever else local equivalents that the Tallarn desert raiders have come across in their journeys. I have no doubt there is an ample supply of critters used to operating in desert environments out there in the galaxy, although few are likely to be quite as agreeable as the Mukali, as somehow these big-ass herbivores, mind you, living in the desert, possess near zero aggressive instincts. Even the males cannot be made to fight, even when specifically trained to do so. Now, to me, the idea of an unconfrontational herbivore in a desert sounds like a nearly uniquely retarded survival strategy, as any other herbivore that comes across the same extraordinarily scarce piece of greenery or water in the desert, all it need do to scare away the probably far larger Mukali is to hiss at it, and thus monopolize the already exceptionally limited resource. But hey, details. The point still remains that clearly the Tallarn have figured out some way of keeping a reliable logistical chain running even in the most hostile of desert environments. This gives them an immense maneuverability advantage over virtually anyone else, which allows them to engage in their favourite tactic of hit-and-run operations or large-scale ambushes. Now, this is where we get back to the idea of combined arms warfare a little bit again, something that the Imperium, of course, is not very fond of, at the very least, not within individual regiments. And so, whilst it would make a tremendous amount of sense for the Tallarn to operate in mixed regiments with a core strength of infantry, with supporting armour, and rough riders as reconnaissance, they instead operate as individual regiments. Now, this actually does have an in-universe explanation that isn't simply the Imperium is incredibly stupid. Rather, it is because the Imperium recognizes the power of combined arms warfare, and so by forcing the regiments to be separate, the idea is that if one goes rogue, the others can combine together and defeat the rogue regiment far more easily. And to be fair, there is a certain point to be made there. Except, of course, when the Imperium runs across formations like the Blood Pact, who could theoretically use combined arms forces way more effectively, and thus beat the shit out of the much vaunted Imperial Guard. But, again, details. So, the Tallarn Desert Raiders and their strategies and tactics. On the larger level, if the Tallarn are able to deploy in significant numbers and cooperate with one another, they prefer to stretch out the enemy's positions as much as possible before initiating offensive operations. Because here's the thing, if you're going to be hitting and running, you want to be hitting and running an already scattered enemy. If they are coordinated and gathered, there is every possibility that you will be overrun by enemy maneuvering elements before you can make your escape. Or worse yet, if the enemy finds you, you might be in the highly unenviable position of getting pinned in place, even as heavier armored elements maneuver around you. And considering the Tallarn's penchants for scattered dispositions, that could very easily mean that they'd be the ones getting picked off in detail. To avoid this, the enemy must be set to chase their own tails. To do this, the Desert Raiders will attempt to infiltrate deep within enemy territory, preferably all the way behind enemy lines. This strategy can be employed on as small an area as the local battlefield, or as large a scenario as in a whole battlefront, or even in an interplanetary setting, where the Tallarns will then use their expertise of surviving in extreme conditions to set up forward bases, weapon caches, and supply depots, which they can use as FOBs to launch raids deep behind enemy lines, striking out against logistic centers, gathering areas for enemy troops, vehicle parks, airfields, or even, potentially, civilian infrastructure, if any such targets should present themselves. This will in turn then hopefully cause the enemy to turn and start looking for these annoying flies biting at their backs, sending units to deal with them. These units will hopefully be engaged and destroyed in turn, causing the enemy to send ever larger formations and dedicate ever larger forces to deal with these insurgents. If the base is discovered and attacked, the Tallarn Desert Raiders will not defend it. The base itself is not important, it is a decoy, and if the enemy is deploying sufficient formations to destroy them, then that means that the objective has been achieved. This process will then be repeated as many times and on as large a scale as needed to start splitting up the enemy front lines, forcing them to dedicate significant forces to garrison duty, to realign patrol, hunting down elusive fighters in the wastes. Once enough forces have been pulled off, the Tallarn will sneak right back out through the lines again and join up with their principal formations. At this point, they should also have gathered a great deal of intelligence on the enemy's positions, as even as these advanced forces carry out their diversionary activities, other formations will be launching small harassing attacks against the enemy, or setting up observation posts to identify the precise locations of the enemy's positions, their front lines, the positions of secondary lines, the position of rapid reaction forces or air assets, etc., etc., artillery batteries, any and all targets that might affect the battle to come. With all this intelligence in mind, and with all their own forces, even as the enemy is beginning to scatter, the Tallarn join together in full force to break through the enemy at their most exposed position, cracking open and scattering the enemy, isolating them in several smaller groupings, to be destroyed at the Tallarn Desert Raiders' leisure. And if they are indeed operating in the kind of areas that they prefer to be in, well, a lot of the time, they don't even need to finish them with las guns or their expertly crafted curved knives. Rather, the desert will do the job for them. And all the Imperial besiegers need do is make sure that they don't escape or get resupplied too easily. A lot of these same tactics also apply on the defensive. If the Desert Raiders are issued orders to defend and protect an area rather than attack the enemy, they still need to locate them. They still need to supply their own troops in the field. And once they've detected enemy movements, they then need to move their own forces in sufficient enough quantities in front of the enemy to attack them. In the case of overwhelming enemy numbers, this process will be repeated many, many times over, with smaller forces picking away at the much larger enemy force. These are lessons that the Tallarns learned well during the initial wars for their homeworld. Armoured formations using dunes as cover, suddenly popping up, losing off a few well-aimed volleys before retreating, and before any organised resistance can try to hunt them down. Sentinels with las cannons, slicing away a vehicle here and there. Infantry heavy weapons teams, hiding under tarps in the deep desert, virtually undetectable by most auspexes, emerging and firing off a few crack and frag missiles before melting back into the desert once more. If the enemy pursue, then that is all good and well. After all, dispersing an enemy offensive column is a lot easier than a formed line. And just like on the offense, the Tallarn Desert Raiders will attempt to scatter the enemy as much as possible before launching themselves at full force against them. If this cannot be achieved, then the weakening and picking off process will continue for as long as possible, until eventually the Desert Raiders reach whatever objective they are set to defend and need to face down the enemy head on. But, make no mistake, the Raiders are not merely guerrilla forces. They are a fully fledged Imperial Guard regiment like any other, amply supplied with heavy weaponry and men capable of using them. Their armoured formations are not merely sentinels stinging at an enemy's flanks. They are well equipped with Lehman Russ battle tanks and tank destroyers. They also prefer heavy-hitting weaponry, like plasma guns and missile launchers, which also add a great deal of versatility to their sting. The Raiders are more than capable of standing in an open line against the enemy. They just prefer to defeat them in detail best before committing to that final decisive battle. For after all, a true warrior never fights fair. And with that, I'll bid you adieu once again. Until next time, thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.